nuts and bolts presentation about
thank you.
the opening of the job letter. I've seen a number of application letters from a variety of specialties over the years, and I've written a couple of my own. So I reverse engineered my own letter. And I also thought about it in relation to the ones that had been associated with other successful searches over the years. And I don't mean this as a template in any sense, but I do sort of want to offer it up as what worked for me and where the sort of intersections are with other letters I've seen that also have been effective. So I want to start with some of the opening moves that you're probably going to want to make in the letter. The first is just to define your area of research. And as you're doing that, you want to acknowledge the job ad that you are applying for. So once you get the letter in place, you're going to be able to adjust the first couple of sentences and perhaps some segments in the middle and at the end to gear the letter toward whatever job you're sending your letter toward at that moment. You don't want to write a different letter for each job. You want to write something that's flexible, but you also want to be careful not to create some kind of template that you think is going to work for every job, because you're going to find out that they all have little nuances. And if you're showing sensitivity to the nuances, I think you have more of a chance of making your way to later stages of the process. So make sure that you're acknowledging the job ad from the beginning, and you're finding ways to get the attention of a reader who's probably overwhelmed. So you want to find some sort of succinct language for getting their attention. Do your best to make that opening gambit memorable and clear, and also think about the timeliness of it. It could be that whatever you're working on has significance across historical periods, and you can imagine it being significant well into the future. But nevertheless, you want to make an argument for why this matters now. That's one of the things that your first few sentences should touch on, in my view, to capture the interest of an overworked job committee reader. After you sort of set the stage with your research agenda and the sort of description of your identity, I think you'll want to start veering toward the list of, or the listing of publications in the letter, foregrounding those that are most tightly related to the advertisement. And if you can, accentuate those that appear in well-regarded journals or those that have been taken up by key presses. That will stand you in good position. Not to say that any of this is necessary, but if these things are part of what you have to offer, positioning them early in the document is going to be useful for you. Once you have given a nod to the publications, then move on to awards that you have received at national or international levels, university-wide or departmental awards, ones that help to sort of define your scholarly identity, your identity as a writer. From there, if you have won any grants, I think getting those into the first paragraph can be a good thing. You do want to think pretty carefully about the sequence of the opening paragraph. Again, making sure that it's sequenced in a way to show how you fit what they're asking for in the job call is something you should keep in mind. The overall significance of what you do should be clear by the end of the first paragraph. And you also want it to be a kind of mini narrative that gives them a sense of who you are. This may all sound like a lot, but and I guess in a way it is, but what's important about this is doing it in an economical way. Everything I've described up to this point should fit into 150 or 200 words. So I think you're going to have to be careful about what you include and what you cut, and it probably means that you're going to have to make multiple passes at this. It's not likely that you're going to get it all right the first time. You want to write, let it sit, come back and ask, what can I cut to give this the kind of crystalline quality that I want in order to make the impression that is necessary for moving forward in the process. Okay, so I have sort of talked about the opening paragraph, and maybe we got to the nuts and bolts of all this a little too quickly. We probably could have set the stage a little more, but we'll do more of that as the session goes on. You're going to have either one or two research paragraphs that are going to be pretty high stakes instances of composition, because they're going to define your dissertation or creative project or your line of inquiry and how it suits the gap that they're trying to fill in their departmental program. So you'll want in the opening lines of that paragraph to describe the major argument of the project. This is 3 or 4 sentences. Then you want to move from there to what the project does and why it matters. So some of that you will have hinted at in the opening paragraph. This will give you a little more room to elaborate. And you'll want to show your readership why this is significant for people who, in my case, study rhetoric and composition, but whatever your particular specialty is, and then even your sub-area within that specialty. So if there are people who are really focused on Blake studies, and there's a question that is sort of at the pulsing heart of the study of William Blake's work right now, and you can show how your research project speaks to that question, then I think you're doing yourself a service. And you're also doing the work of making this letter a little more memorable, from the pile of applications that the search committee is likely to receive. You want to think about what makes it distinctive. How does it stand out? And it may be that it stands out not only for what you have to say and the thesis that you develop, but the method that you have for getting there. It may be that there's a composite theoretical approach that you took in order to derive the insights that are really driving the dissertation. Explain the novelty of that, what it is that makes the work different. And maybe in some cases it's an empirical project that's led to really surprising findings. And I think you're going to want to hit those early in the research paragraph so that they lodge in the consciousness of your audience. Once you have outlined the project in a few sentences and talked a little bit about its significance and what makes it distinctive, then you're going to move into the overall structure of the work. Here you're not going to be able to do a chapter-by-chapter breakdown, so it may be that you already have a prospectus that is something you've worked on long and hard with your advisor and your committee. Look back at that and take the key nuggets and sort of derive from that a shape, something that you can fit within, let's say, 300 to 350 words to say this is what the book does. So again, you're going to want to describe the arc of the text and the key points from the most illuminating chapters rather than trying to give a chapter-by-chapter summation. And wherever you can, relate those key points back to the major contribution of the work. So all of this is feeling not only unified in terms of what the project is doing, but working to create a sense of you as a kind of integrated scholar. Things are all coming together to make this tightly organized research project and teaching plan or line of inquiry that you're going to bring with you to the job. Some considerations about audience. I said 300 to 350. I suppose after the 150, 200 words in the opening paragraph, the next 2 paragraphs you can maybe give yourself as much as 400 words. But once you start to get onto the second page of this single-spaced document, you're going to want to start wrapping up the research description pretty quickly so you can leave yourself room to talk about your teaching and your service. So this shouldn't leap too far onto the second page. You do want to make sure as you are describing the work that you're using your own language as much as possible. It may be that there are key quotations that you really want to engage with and that you spend a lot of time parsing in the work itself, but you can include those in the writing sample. Here, it's so significant that, that you're thinking in terms of economy and that you're putting things into your own language, that even a few lines from another scholar can actually take up needed space. Now actually, as I'm working my way through this and looking back through my letter, I realized that I sort of broke that rule, and there I have a quotation that's 3 lines from a book by Christy Fleckenstein that I really wanted to, and I thought this would be a way of showing my audience that what I'm up to is fresh and it has legs, and now I sort of wish that I'd spent more time putting things into my own words. But maybe you can get away with some of that, but you certainly don't want in this document to let other people's language guide the case that you're making about what you do. Even though some of what you're going to say is compressing a lot of sophisticated stuff into a super small space, you want to create the impression of this being relaxed and natural, and that you have a command of the material that you could describe to people at any level of familiarity. Okay, I've mentioned word economy, trying to balance the sophistication of what you're doing with the accessibility to an audience that in some cases is going to be highly specialized and know exactly what you're talking about, but there's probably going to be at least one person on that committee who is chipping in and is going to have great questions should you get that far down the line, but isn't a specialist and is going to need some of the finer points explained. So, you know, keep that more general reader in mind as well as you're working on this, and think about the balance between impressing the specialist and being sure that the person who hasn't read what you read has some idea what you're talking about. I feel like this is going on at length. I'm sorry about that.
Good.
Let's see. I mentioned the coherence of the letter, the relationship between the unity of these opening paragraphs and the sense of a coherent identity that you're presenting to potential interviewers. And I think that that's key to the rhetorical effect that you want this document to achieve. Some process points. I said early on that I think this is probably not something to be completed in one sitting. You may feel like you've nailed it right off the bat, but one of the things I've realized is that when I come back to something even a day later, how different it feels and how I start to recognize that there are things that really need clarification and there are things that I could just lop off. And investing in the clarity and getting comfortable with leaving things out and saying, okay, that's going to show up in my writing sample, or I can explain that when we get to the interview, but now I really need to highlight the absolutely crucial points. And so that means coming back to those early drafts with a tough mindset, asking what you can clarify, what you can cut. Do I have the key phrasings I need? It may take 5 or 6 drafts of this, depending on what kind of writer you are, to actually get those lines that are really descriptive of what it is you do and want to do and how you fit what they're asking for in the job call. And in that way, this exercise is useful not only for writing a strong job letter, but it's useful for sort of figuring out how to answer that question when it comes up in any number of contexts. It may come up on an elevator in LA. Someone asks you to describe your project, and if you have narrowed down to the really key phrases that are accessible and rich at the same time, then you'll have those sort of in your quiver to go to. And so it's hopefully helpful work, even if it's a little excruciating at the time. It will pay dividends over the long haul. And the last thing, which is probably the most obvious thing that I'll say, is don't feel like you need to be doing this alone after this workshop, but go to your mentors, your directors, your committee, come to us with drafts, and we'll be happy to reply to what you have produced and hopefully generate some dialogue about it that gets you the best chance of getting noticed on the market with this document. So that's it.
Really good.
Should I take questions now or wait until the end?
I
Yeah.
think now,
Okay.
and then we could always get you back later
Sure.
if we went in the group conversation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As you're saying, I mean, at least with, you say acknowledge the job ad. I mean, with your letter, kind of like the second paragraph and everything, kind of could be like standard once you got that knocked out. And then that first paragraph you can kind of tailor to the certain job ad, or should you be looking at doing a different letter for every single job ad?
No, I don't think you're going to write a different letter for every job ad. I think that, in the beginnings you'll need to craft to meet, I mean, at least in my experience, that I think it's going to be different for different specialties. But I think you're going to need to make very sure that each letter is actually going to the right place. I've seen people make mistakes and send, because they apply to 60 or 70 places, and it's easy to make a mistake. So you want to watch and make sure you're focused on that institution at that time, and get it right at the beginning, get it right at the end when you acknowledge the job ad. But there also may be some moments in the middle in which you can amplify things within the argument of the dis or project that show how it's related to that job. I don't think you're going to have to do a lot of that, but it may be that it's a job that you really want. It sticks its head out from the other jobs, and so you might take a little bit more time to show how the argument that you're making is really suited to who they want to bring forward.
The last paragraph has some of that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Other questions?
There are good breakdowns. I think this is excellent. Chris, thank you.
Yeah.
In those various resources that Laura has gathered for us, there are some very step-by-step instructions. They're well formulated as well, that will get into how you talk about service as well.
Right.
Examples of how to write the teaching paragraph. Yeah.
And there's a difference between writing the teaching paragraph and writing the teaching statement. Some institutions are actually going to want a teaching philosophy, and so you can have, they may give you specifications for how long that should be. I tended to fill up one single space page with the teaching philosophy, and I would do that by sort of looking to a classical figure in composition pedagogy, someone who has been a key contributor for a long time, and also someone whose voice has, emerged more recently, but is getting a lot of attention, and relating what I do in the classroom to, a long tradition as well as where things seem to be moving. There's not as much space to do that within the teaching paragraph of the letter. In the teaching paragraph of the letter, you're going to have to talk in really practical terms about what you've taught and why it's worked, and the kinds of positive feedback you've gotten from students. And if you have strong evaluations, you certainly want to emphasize that. So it's not as much of a statement of philosophy, although there will be moments that say, if you went ahead and wrote out the teaching philosophy, that you could draw into your letter in the teaching paragraph, maybe slightly rephrase it, but again, show that this is who you are as a teacher.
And when you say what you've taught, it might be an example of a text that you pair with a painting,
Right.
and how you use that to address this other field over here.
Right.
Just one sort of example that is illustrative.
I was thinking, to make sure that you would list the various classes that you've
Hmm.
taught. Maybe it's just an introductory and an intermediate composition course, but if you've had a chance to teach a summer seminar or something like that, make sure to highlight it. But I think Julie is absolutely right. If there is a lesson that was particularly productive and you think helps to, what's the word that I want? Condense your identity into a small narrative, then do it. That would be a good way to show your readers how you think about teaching, and again, to make that impression that you want them to leave with. And you want your impression to, in some ways, be competitive and to even rise above the other kinds of descriptions of pedagogy that they're likely to see. And it's really difficult work to do that because you can't know what it is that other people are producing, but nevertheless you want to try to make it as distinctive as possible.
Right. And that comes from have it be interesting.
And one of the ways you know that, I think, is by getting feedback from people you trust, right? Relying on your mentors, your committee, and saying, is this the moment that I should pull from my pedagogy to talk about what I do? Does it relate nicely enough to what I'm doing in the dissertation? And I think you might get some blunt and honest feedback first. And it may be that it's exactly right off the bat, but oftentimes it takes a process. It takes several tries to get to the piece that you're actually going to want to keep.
I'm sorry, it's 2 pages, right? Or a page and a half?
For
like
the whole letter?
The whole letter.
I think you can, and Chris and Julian may have a better sense of this, I think it's okay to run a little bit onto the 3rd page, but I haven't seen many letters go far beyond that.
Yeah.
I think you start to trickle onto the 3rd page, you're verging on going too long. And I think oftentimes committees have enough to read that at that point they're going to stop whether you have stopped or not. Take advantage of the space you're allotted.
It's always that same order. It's dissertation, what we're summary of what I can do first, and then
research,
and
teaching,
then teaching,
citizenship or service, however you want to think about it. And this is a point at which I would sort of look for feedback from other people, but when I have guided or worked with people who were going on the market before, I was sort of rigid about this structure. This is the way you need to do it. There's a lot of latitude within the structure, but move from research to teaching to service. And one of my Rec Comp students was really resistant. He tried it, he didn't have a great experience, and then he decided he was going to move all of this stuff about teaching up to the front, and he started to get bites and nibbles. So that makes me think that maybe it's not as rigid as I thought it was.
Maybe I'll jump in here because this is, in some ways, a couple of the things that I wanted to talk about were how especially some specific concerns about job letters and teaching statements for creative writers, and also a few concerns about some of these. Really, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. I find the production of these documents to be abominably difficult and time-consuming. But also, I do want to address what I consider to be some specific issues that I think are relevant to everyone, but I have observed, I see disproportionately from women. So, one of the advantages I think that creative writers have when we approach a document like a job letter is that we are somewhat familiar with working in form, and this is a very specific form. For creative writers, it's very, very similar to exactly what Chris has described. An introductory paragraph that acknowledges the institution and the specific position to which you are applying, and then it outlines your eligibility for this candidacy in a really specific way in terms of your education, in terms of if they say, we're looking for someone who has at least 1 book out, then you had better have a book in that first paragraph, so that you're addressing the specific qualifications you have to the description of the job that you have read. You can also list some of the things that set you apart, because I'm not sure what the situation is in all of the other fields, but in creative writing, the people reading your application will be reading upwards of sometimes 200 applications. And so one of the things that you want to do in your first paragraph is to mention some of the things that will set you apart from some of the other candidates in terms of accomplishments, in terms of working in multiple genres or hybrid genres, or doing something that's uniquely innovative or interesting, in terms of a couple of really specific, exciting publications, those kinds of things, but keep it really professional and succinct. Your second paragraph is going to be your research, which in your case is going to be your most recent finished work. So if you have a book out and you're working on a second book, you're probably going to want to talk first about the book that's actually out. And then there will be an opportunity to transition into sort of talking about like some of these similar concerns up here in my current project, and then you can talk a little bit about your current project. And in your, this is my creative writing work paragraph. This paragraph is deeply important in a few extraordinary ways. One of which is, depending on the job, you will either be writing this paragraph about in which you discuss your own work in an articulate and rigorous way to like 3 fiction writers and a poet because you're coming to teach at a research one that has a robust graduate program. But it is equally likely, if not more likely, that there will be maybe 1 and possibly no creative writers on your search committee. They might be hiring their only creative writing faculty, and certainly they might be hiring their only creative writing faculty member in that genre. So something to keep in mind is that the way that you undertake the enterprise of describing your own work is something that should be impressive to creative writers who would be on the faculty in terms of addressing how you place yourself in a literary context, but also how what you are doing is significant or different or writes its way into a space that hasn't already been filled by a lot of other stuff, but that is also going to be really accessible and comprehensible and compelling and interesting to people who are not necessarily creative writers. To put alongside this, it is not always the case, but it is sometimes the case that people who do literary research and scholarship sometimes look upon us as creative writers as being a little on the wooey side. So it is advisable to make sure that you actually do sort of follow some of the guidelines and expectations of the form, because one of the things that you may find yourself doing is making an attempt to convince people who are not necessarily all creative writers that you are a serious scholar and that you are making a legitimate contribution to your field. And so, these are some things that are a little bit unique to the creative writing enterprise. It also demonstrates that you're a real writer, because one of the differences between being an amateur or undergraduate level creative writer and a graduate level creative writer is the ability to talk articulately and concisely about your own work in a way that is unpretentious and that is compelling. And also, this is really important, that accurately reflects your work, so that when you send a writing sample and they look at the way that you've described your work and they look at the writing sample, they see how these two things belong together really clearly. If you write about something and then you send like something else completely different, it's like, okay, well, this may have been true of your first book, but then this isn't the writing sample that you sent. That's going to be really confusing to people. Which, as a side note about writing samples, always send things that have been published. Resist the temptation to send like the brand new thing that you have written and are currently in love with. That's a terrible idea. Please don't do that. The teaching paragraph, I think, is very similar to the way that Chris described it for creative writers. One of the ways I think about it is I have pretty much always started my teaching paragraph with the phrase, "I am prepared to teach the following classes." Really straightforward. And one thing that I will say, you should all be prepared to answer, even if it doesn't all go in the job letter, it will inevitably come up in an interview. And I would almost, this process is extremely time-consuming and enormous, but something that I think you should all consider doing is maybe even writing out hypothetical syllabi for some of the courses if you haven't taught a lot of creative writing classes yet, so that you can address the question, how do you teach an introductory level creative writing class, an intermediate level, an advanced level, and a graduate level creative writing class, and how do you perceive those as different? And one of the things I think is important about the teaching statement and teaching paragraph both, it is my experience that both of those documents tempt us into narrative, especially as creative writers. And I encourage you to try to maybe resist that a little bit. One of the tricks that we all learn as creative writers from the very, very beginning, but that is highly relevant to these documents, is show, don't tell. Don't say like, I'm very passionate about teaching, or I like to blend, tradition and innovation in my teaching. You can say I like to blend tradition and innovation in your teaching, but then you need to support that with a specific example. Like, I had students choose a canonical text and then create an electronic document with hyperlinks that were both humorous and informative in the manner of VHS's old pop-up video, right? That is an example of how you do those things. Or, I teach narrative through video games, or, whatever. I mean, so you want to make claims supported by evidence rather than tell stories and anecdotes, which I see a lot of people sometimes attempt to do, and I would encourage you to sort of resist that, even though I think there is a temptation to sort of, when I was a student, and now that I'm a teacher, to kind of create a story, I would resist that. I would resist that. Because we're talking about different kinds of jobs, one of the things that I think has come up is this sort of tailoring of the form to fit various kinds of jobs, and I'm sure James will talk about this as well when we talk about the differences between the small liberal arts college and the large research university. But I think depending on how robust your description of your work is, do you have 1 or 2 books out? Do you have a book out and a book under contract, or are you finishing a dissertation? It may be to your advantage to actually place your teaching paragraph first, and find a way to transition from your introductory paragraph to your teaching paragraph and then your research, because it may be that they care a lot about your books, but they really want someone who's deeply committed to teaching and is going to come to a small teaching college and stick around. In which case, they're going to want someone who places that teaching paragraph first and then is able to sort of transition from that to talking about their work, and and they're going to care a lot about your work, but they're going to care that it sounds like you want to teach and you want to stay teaching. So that's one way you can kind of tailor that document in creative writing to the different possible jobs that you may be addressing.
Rebecca, sorry, and if I could just add that your CV can mirror that move.
Yes.
So that your CV goes straight from your education to then teaching, then to your, so yeah, I would have 2 different versions if it was, depending on where I was in my career, but also depending on the job. If I felt like this was a small liberal arts college that, like she said, there's 10 people on the faculty. They need you to do a lot. They care about, if you care about teaching, then I do that move in the letter, and then I did the move in the CV as well.
Yeah.
You put it, and it's just a subtle way to say your priorities are matching their priorities.
Yeah.
And I'll speak to that, but I would look at their website, because on the professor's bio, Grinnell professors really got annoyed by that. But I know that Wellesley professors love that. So, but you can see that they tip their hand on the professor bio saying, my research is this, my teaching is this. But at Wellesley's the other way around.
Good.
So they have they show their logic, they show their cards in their own self-representation. So let's keep that up.
Great.
I think that we can talk about CVs too, but again, to sort of, one of the things that I've seen is some maybe false steps in terms of trying to create memorability in documents from creative writers. I saw a job letter one time that started with this sort of flourishy anecdote about how someone was sitting in the desert, looking out at the sky, and a hawk flew by, and they started thinking about how they really wanted to have this job. And I was like, never do that. Just never do that, I mean, one of the ways, and again, since I was kind of talking about the teaching statements, one of the things, and this is going to flow into the other thing I kind of want to say, and then I'll kind of dial it down. But one of the risks that I sometimes see, also particularly in creative writers, is the desire to talk about their feelings. Don't talk about your feelings. Nobody cares. I think one of the things that is easy to sort of slip into is a kind of I care deeply about my students kind of statement. And while I believe that, and I also think that it's extremely important, I think the way that you show that you respect and care about your students is the way that you talk about how you have, in an innovative and individual and invested way, thought about how to be a more effective and exciting teacher. And that will be reflected in your paragraph without you having to say anything about it. So, I would avoid any kind of statement that sounds anything like I am very passionate about teaching or anything of that nature, because I think it can be assumed, but the question is like, can you prove it? This sort of leads into the other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, which I think is totally relevant to everybody, but I do see it sort of disproportionately reflected in these documents coming from women. Women tend to feel very fortunate to have gotten awards that they deserved, and to feel very grateful for opportunities that they're entirely qualified for, or to feel humbled to have been given a position that they were, that they absolutely should have had, and this kind of undermining rhetoric. And I certainly have seen documents from male writers that have made similar moves, and it's equally inadvisable in anybody. But I do think that women sort of do a lot of self-deprecating and self-undermining in a lot of their documents. And I would just advise everybody, this is not a place to be humble. Don't be arrogant, obviously, but be professional and be matter-of-fact. This is a place to be very matter-of-fact and collegial, but not to express gratitude or fortune or humility or any of these things. Just say what you've done and say what you're going to do and get out. And I think this sort of, related to this is something I think that also everybody experiences, but women, and for some reason particularly, I know why, but particularly when we're on the job market, we experience what people sometimes call fraud complex or imposter syndrome. And again, not unique to women, just sort of disproportionately represented in the women that I've worked with. And so here's the last thing I want to say on the subject of fraud complex and imposter syndrome. That is not a bad feeling. I mean, it feels bad to experience it, but what that really is the feeling of attempting something you have not yet succeeded at. It is the feeling of pushing one's envelope and doing something new. It does not mean that you are not qualified, it does not mean that you are not capable, and it does not mean that you will not succeed. It just means that you have the feeling of not having succeeded at that quite yet. And I would embrace it as a feeling of growth and enlargement, rather than letting it get under your skin and make you feel bad about the work that you're doing. So, right. So I'll sort of dial back to that. I'm sure we'll have more to say. There are many more documents to talk about, but I want to make sure you have time, please.
Any questions though first that you want to ask right now for Rebecca?
Yeah.
What you're talking about in terms of the paragraph order in the letter, that's a really good tip. Thank you for checking the bios on the website. But I was wondering if that doesn't work. There are some slacks that are top tier, and so do they want somebody with a lot of awards and publications, or do they want somebody who's going to be more of a teacher? And how do you tell, in that case, how can you make that decision, what order to put your paragraph?
I can let you answer that. I was going to talk directly about that.
No, actually, since you are going to talk directly about it, why don't you go for it?
Well, I'll start at the end then, because that's my last point. I think you should see when they got their terminal degree. I think it depends on what generation they're in. I think there's an older generation that does want to see that you want to spend the next 40 years, being a liberal arts college professor and teaching. There's a younger generation. The job market is so competitive now that every job committee will think that, okay, I can get the cream of the crop in any field. So there's a younger generation that is pushing themselves. They're trained in R1 schools or very prestigious programs, and they want to have research or productivity. So I think if you look at younger professors, look at what they put on their bios. I mean, are they splashing their awards in their publications, and that's what they're proud of? Or you will see professors that have taught at a liberal arts college for like 50 years, and they will not mention a single publication, they will not mention any awards, but they'll talk about community building, and I don't know, I'm very proud of the annual banquet that I run or something. They will tip their hands. You'll see what makes them say, what are they proud of? But by and large, this generational shift, you'll see it in every liberal arts college, every teaching institution. The older generation, when the job market is very different, they want to see certain things from you. The younger generation will be different. That said, it's tough because oftentimes the job committees will be mingled. So you'll just have to do your homework. Just look at different websites. And this gets to your earlier question about tailoring. You will have boilerplate paragraphs, but you won't have to rewrite your letter for each different institution. But you will have to adapt your paragraph slightly for each kind of institution. So for example, you can't just switch the teaching paragraph and put it up front and put the research paragraph second, or research section second. You'll have to write a new transition between those two, obviously. So your lead-in will be, if you're leading the teaching, it needs to be your lead-in. Like that needs to be your opening gambit. And then there needs to be some kind of pivot to your research. You can't do a copy and paste. I say that because I have seen copy and paste jobs on different searches I've been in, and it's pandering. At liberal arts colleges, they're like, I can see what you did. You think you got our number, and you just did the copy and paste. So you do have to write a different kind. You can have the same paragraph, but a different transition, and a different lead into it too. Just in general, a lot of my comments are going to piggyback nicely off of what Chris and Rebecca talked about. I was just coming straight off the market. I was just going to talk about some tips and tactics that have been personally useful for me that I wish people had told me much earlier on. And as Rebecca was mentioning, whatever field you're in, I come from Grinnell College, but that was my previous job, where a small liberal arts college where multiple people in multiple disciplines did participate in search committees across campus. So for example, I was on search committees that hired a computer scientist, an art historian, the dean of the library, a novelist, and a creative nonfiction writer. And vice versa, there was a novelist on my search committee. So you have to think about writing to multiple audiences, and if you're sort of dialed in on one certain mode, the job market will force you to, I think it's a good exercise though, because you'll learn how to speak in different voices, sort of. So the tips I've seen from my own experiences, but also being on search committees for these different fields. The main word that my graduate advisor at Berkeley told me, which still rings in my head every time I send out a job letter or every time I really speak and write, is crisp. That's, just constantly think of the word crisp. Do not ramble. Do not, this is not sort of a phenomenological reverie. Things will have to be one sentence. This also transfers to interviews. When people ask a question, answer the damn question. Be crisp. Say, yes, comma, here's the answer. There's no real build-up allowed. I think there isn't a lot of sort of warm-up time, both in the letter and in your sort of interview subsequently. So just remember the word crisp. Constantly apply the crisp test to yourself. The second thing is, one thing I want to talk about was interdisciplinarity, because my current job is, being hired here is very interdisciplinary. My previous job was very standard Renaissance literature, Shakespeare and Milton. So I had to tailor my job materials, my interview strategies totally differently. So you will have to do that. You can't have just a sort of one-size-fits-all letter or set of materials. You will probably have to have sort of squarely within your field, if your committee is all people that are totally knowledgeable in your specialty, that is one set of materials. But then you'll need a general set of materials, whether for a small liberal arts college or some kind of hybrid position. I'm DH Renaissance, so I knew that there are many, many different kinds of people reading my application. So I needed to focus more on the interdisciplinary side. And that's not only a question of sort of tactically how you put the materials together, but tone. So are you saying that, applying to the Shakespeare and Milton job, I was like, I love the canon. Man, I just really believe in Shakespeare. Literature matters. But then the interdisciplinary job, I'm like, well, we need to be wave of the future. Let's think about new hybrid crossings of literature and technology, etc. So your tone, your rhetoric has to change. You know, the pitch you're selling for yourself. Are you more the speaking to sort of conventional formations of knowledge, or are you saying proposing new ones? And you know, depending on how you frame it, you can probably do both. That said, all that's to say is read the job description carefully. Both of you have mentioned this, and it sounds obvious, but I see so many people that do not do this. They send boilerplate job letters in, and they obviously did not read the specifics of the job description. So, as you were saying, like, as Rebecca was saying, I'm qualified to teach these courses. That's a key question in every search committee's conversation, saying, okay, we have these 3 classes that this job description is really hired to teach. Address that. Don't say in general, you know, I can teach X, Y, and Z, but say I'm qualified to teach these 3 courses, and you know, here's how I propose to do so. Let's see here. I'll speak specifically about digital work as part of interdisciplinarity. You know, digital humanities, digital media, digital stuff in general is growing, but there is a tendency I've seen in some letters to just sort of wedge it in because it's a cool catchphrase, like I have a blog, or like I'm like 40,000 people following on Twitter. That will not get any traction. So it can't just be a throwaway digital thing. It has to be like some serious digital thing. It can't be seen like a whimsical sort of thing, because that seems like pandering as well. And
we got some of those last year.
Yeah. I mean, it's a competitive job market, so they're like, "Wow, I'm really popular on Twitter." So that's sort of digital. Let's see here. You know, Chris did a great job talking about from the Red Comp and literature angle, and Rebecca talked about from the creative writing angle. But what I'll say about the research section in general is, you know, you'll have to hone that a lot. That is really the meat and potatoes, and it's like the main thrust, even for a small liberal arts college. They want to see what's your intellectual angle. People give this a fair shake. I mean, people, no matter how tired and overwhelmed they are and over-inundated by materials, they will read your research section in earnest. But that said, in the first couple of sentences, it has to make sense. How does it make sense? So, other than the word crisp, the second phrase, which I'll describe for all of your materials for the job market, is so what? You constantly have to ask yourself, so what? But not so what in a sort of topical way always, but so what that you're making some kind of coherent intervention, argument, angle. It can't be an exploration talking about your feelings, a loose clustering of topics. It has to be, so what, I'm saying this. I'm answering this question, here's this existing debate, I'm addressing this. Here's a social problem, I'm reimagining it in this. So the so what is important. Don't be shy, say it. I think that you have a lot of buildup in longer form stuff to get at something, and at the end you're like, aha, see? So what? You don't have time to do that. So don't be shy, don't beat around the bush, tell them so what, or show them so what, but they should immediately see the impact, like, wow, okay, I get it. This is your angle, this is what's different, this is your twist. Transitions, it can seem dismayingly formulaic to have your intro paragraph and your research section, your teaching section. Where you can really make a difference is your transition, your pivot points. So for example, I mean, the thing that I use in my letter, which has worked for me well in the past, and everyone has a different strategy, but the quote from my letter was like, between the research and the teaching was, while being committed to blank, for me it was like serious historical scholarship. My research and teaching strive to show why it matters in today's world. And then I go into my teaching section, talking about sort of the making Shakespeare alive for students in the current generation. So that will allay the fears of, you know, you want to show you're a serious scholar, you're a serious contributor to your field, but at the same time, you want to make things topical and fresh and new for your students. So whatever your pivot is, you need, one sentence can do a lot of work to make it seem like they're not just reading a boring formula, that your research somehow feeds in to your teaching. Let's see. The teaching letter, I talked about the small liberal arts college, it really depends on the generation. I would just do your homework. Look at who, you know, you won't know who's on the search committee necessarily, but sometimes they'll say, for any questions in the job ad, contact the search chair blank at this email address. Look that person up. And just start close reading their bio and see what makes them tick. And the question you asked earlier, are they showing their publications and awards, or are they talking about their teaching? You can learn so much from that person.
there's a double bind in teaching paragraphs and statements of teaching philosophy, because at the end of the day, you do need to teach writing. I mean, you have to teach students how to write and think critically, all the liberal arts ethos values. But it's the same idea, everyone's going to say that. So you have to find a way to show your competency in basic writing, teaching, critical thinking, but have some kind of different angle, whether it's experiential learning is really hot in small liberal arts colleges, mashing of digital versus literary modes, etc. But find a way that's different than simply saying that I know how to teach students how to write a really good sentence, basically. Let's see here. The last thing I'll say is that I think that diversity statements I've seen historically are much more difficult for other fields. So for example, I interviewed someone at Grinnell for a physics job. It's exceedingly hard because they were like, what do I say for diversity in physics? For coming from an English program, you have the advantage of linguistic diversity. So I've seen letters that have really blown me away talking about sort of the polyphony of languages and language traditions, genres, modes that you encounter every day. Secondly, UC is the awesome advantage of being a public urban school. So the students you encounter, the world you live in, the social context, will give you a sort of angle on diversity, which is very different than someone coming from Yale, for example. So I would really emphasize that. Gritty is the wrong word, but it'll give you street cred. You're more gritty, you have this interesting angle on things that the ivory tower might not. Last thing, and this might sound really weird, but shut down your social media. Or manage it at the very least. I have known personally 2 friends that have been disqualified from jobs.
Me too.
Because they are very politically active, which I fully support, but some of the more staid, older people on search committees said, I find that repugnant. So don't make it easy for them to disqualify you. So just tamp down the social media a little bit when you do that part.
In one case, it was someone who was disqualified because of a rather unseemly photograph from a grad school party that was on their Facebook page.
There you go.
So it did not make them seem very, very serious or take seriousable.
Also tweets about, man, the job market sucks. Like, oh my God, I'm so stressed out. Why don't they answer me? This is a rigged system. Like, make that all private. You just tamp down on that.
Dial down the resentment as much as possible.
Once you get hired, you can reactivate all that. Any questions? Yeah.
Can I just ask about your digital humanities? Does that count as also teaching online and stuff like that, or?
Yeah. I mean, that's controversial, but yes, digital stuff is a big tent. So digital pedagogy, digital literacy, that's certainly part of it. It's up to you to frame it as such, though. It's not a blank check, but saying that here's how the digital aspect of what you do, how that fits into everything else you're doing. It has to sort of fit in as a whole.
Yeah, for example, I just saw an article on, it's like Digital Pedagogy Online magazine about using digital pedagogy towards more effective ways of accommodating students with disability, for instance. So,
Which involved research.
yeah.
Right. So I think what Chris and I were on the committee that were lucky enough to hire James, and we got some that were about pedagogy, but it wasn't anything that the scholar was investigating or writing about or studying.
It was all sort of anecdotal.
Right, so we were looking for research or production in the digital mode, editorial production, and some overlay between the teaching and the digital in the classroom, which was not, James did not say, I teach online, but is going to teach some integration at some point of drama and, or Shakespeare and Milton, and sort of thinking digitally.
Yeah, and to answer your question, building off what Rebecca is saying, that if you had a book on disability study or something, then that would make total sense. Like here, I am totally coherent as a candidate because here's how my research and teaching all fit together, and the digital is the bridge or something. But it has to make sense.
Well, you don't want to just throw in, I also teach online.
No.
The bonus points move does not work.
No, that's on your CV. And one of the things that, well, I'm sure we'll end up talking more about as we continue to sort of talk about the job market search and the documents and the interviews and everything else, requests for additional materials and things is, you know, how much overlap you want to exist between your documents, like a teaching statement in a job letter or a CV and like an introductory paragraph, but also, you know, like the different purposes of each of those that each of those documents really serve, the ways that people look at them really differently. I mean, I talked a little bit about it in that, like, the way that you as graduate creative writers talk about your work should be accurately reflected in your writing sample, for example. But these kinds of things, and I will say, I think that one of the sort of spectacularly interesting things about working in this discipline is that one of the central enterprises of it is to synthesize what might seem to somebody initially like potentially sort of disconnected or even potentially like conflicting ideas and enterprises, like the Renaissance and digital humanities. Like that sort of seems like then and now, you know, but it's a brilliant synthesis of methods and practices and research. Mm-hmm. So, you know, one of the things is if you are at a very early stage in your graduate career, you might think of what it is that you do and you know about and you're interested in that you can start to think about synthesizing in that way. And if you're already a little bit further along, what do you already do? We all sort of already on some level do that, and it's sort of about kind of curating and being a good steward of our own talents. You know what I mean?